Well, it's becoming pretty clear that Alistair MacIntyre really does not like bureaucrats. And so I'm going to entitle this one, which covers chapters 6 and 7 of After Virtue, Are Bureaucratic Rulers Creatures of Enlightenment's Failure? He might as well have used the term bureaucratic overlords. So in chapter 6, he briefly kind of restates his argument that the problem for the Enlightenment philosophers was that they located traditional morality as grounded in superstition. That's because of the strong bias against the Christian heritage that they were dealing with. And from Hobbes on, there was this hostility to Aristotle and Aristotelian teleological theory, which had been more or less combined with Christian theology in the Middle Ages. So that had all been labeled superstition, not grounded in any sort of facts, but in wishful thinking of some kind about God and spirits and a transcendent reality that one couldn't see. But now we were living in an age of science and reason, and so one couldn't put one's hopes in those things. So there had to be some new ground for morality, and it would either be located in desire, which basically is covered by MacIntyre as utilitarianism early on, which then turns into emotivism and intuitionism, or in reason, which he deals with through Immanuel Kant and the categorical imperative. So in general, he takes on in chapter 6 the utilitarian argument and the natural right argument as well. And he dismisses utilitarians because they can't be consistent and argue that some pleasures are better than others. So in the utilitarian reasoning, if it's consistent, all pleasures are equal, but then how can you really even govern without in a way having to prioritize some pleasures or some human goods over others, and then that leads to basically asserting that some are better than others without any real rational backing. And this is what he says leads to intuitionism and emotivism, which is just basically underlying it is we feel like this is the right way to go right now. Then MacIntyre makes the statement really quite strongly that the Enlightenment natural rights theory seemed and was groundless, a groundless construction that can't be logically defended. And this statement seems to be not only what he considers to be the Enlightenment failure to find a real grounding for rights, but it is also MacIntyre's point of view. His opinion or conclusion is there is no such thing as natural rights, that natural rights are a construction that come out of a particular people, time and place, namely Europe, asserted during the Enlightenment based upon this fiction of the state of nature and all of that, and it's a cultural construction that is treated as though it's got some sort of universal validity. So MacIntyre basically says there is no such thing as natural rights. Well, I've got a quote there. He says, "For the truth is plain, there are no such things, and belief in them is one with belief in witches and unicorns." Every once in a while, MacIntyre really gets off a good quote where his I guess more like his derisive attitude shows up, and that's definitely one of them, witches and unicorns. I'm sure he was smiling when he wrote that. And he says both were elaborated, that is utilitarianism and the natural rights philosophy, both were elaborated in a situation in which substitute artifacts for the concepts of an older and more traditional morality were required, substitutes that had to have a radically innovative character if they were to give even an appearance of performing their new social functions. So here he's just reminding us that in his view, basically these newer ways of thinking were trying to, in a way, justify older traditional moral principles on a new foundation and the new foundation was just not good enough. It was contradictory, self-contradictory, and ultimately did not allow people to have any sort of certainty such as they had before. I thought this was a poignant quote. He says, at this point in time, after the Enlightenment failure, each moral agent, each person, now spoke unconstrained by the externalities of divine law, natural teleology, or hierarchical authority, but why should anyone else now listen to him? And so this is the dilemma of the modern post-Enlightenment moralist, is that ultimately, where do they go for grounding? Where do they show any sort of solid support for their moral preferences? He has tried to show that ultimately none of their arguments hold up and they are internally contradictive. Who knows what brings the most people the most pleasure, and what makes the majority's definition of what brings pleasure better than any other? And don't we know that sometimes what the majority thinks will bring them pleasure is also what ends up ruining them? And who knows what natural rights are? Was there ever a state of nature? Was there ever any sort of time in which people actually reasoned and came to any sort of agreement, a social contract? Or is that all just a construction, and a construction born out of a particular cultural heritage? Well, that's what MacIntyre thinks. And so what's going on here is he's really constructing a thoroughgoing critique of modernity generally. And he keeps bringing it up to date in his references to the bureaucrat, to protest, to the scientists, and so on. So in one place he talks about the modern protest as a mechanism of voicing political opinion in a time when people think in terms of rights and utility. And he says that protest becomes the way of dealing with the violation of your rights, which he thinks are fictional, in the name of someone else's utility, which he thinks is really problematic. And so really what you've got with protests is a group of people who all agree with each other that they don't like something, and they know that really the only way to get any sort of attention and maybe force a change is through being annoying enough or being threatening enough. And this is why modern protests have this negative and shrill character or performative character that stems from the fact that protest itself, he says, is also a groundless assertion. These are Extinction Rebellion protesters, and they would beg to differ, and they would say that they are grounding their assertion in science. And so it might be kind of interesting to think about what MacIntyre would think of this type of protest that claims very hard to be like grounded in reason and science. He has some respect for science as opposed to social science. He has some respect, it seems to me, for the physical sciences. But he was writing during a time when this type of protest wasn't the main thing, but they were anti-war protests. There were, protests over race and economics and things like that, but not so much large-scale protests about the environment as we're now having. He says that protesting in this way is treated as a necessity in order to get any sort of attention to make a change, and it probably is a necessity if people really underneath are only moved by force. And MacIntyre is basically arguing without any sort of real good grounding for your arguments, you're left with, this is the way I want it to be because I want it that way, and then that leads to, of course, some attempt at force. And when you think about it, mass protest is a form of force. It's a form of force which is sometimes necessary. It worked to bring down the former Soviet Union and Eastern Bloc, but it is still a form of force. He argues that a technique called unmasking becomes popular in the modern world as opponents try to show that those whom they disagree with are simply power grabbers who are using whatever emotive arguments they've come up with as a cover for their true motivation, namely that they want to control things. But those who unmask others also wear a mask, in his view, and so it's this endless game of exposing the other's hypocrisy while trying to avoid being exposed oneself. And he returns to these three modern characters, and he asks the question, how do they feel and how do they operate in this modern context where there doesn't seem to be any solid support for one's moral preferences? And very briefly, he says the aesthete is somebody, the artist type, the kind of surfer on the wave of modern modes and fashions, is most comfortable in this new moral landscape because that is a type of person who can basically blow with the wind, so to speak. The therapist, though, is going to be more disturbed by this because at the heart of what the therapist does is some sort of claim to expertise, to knowing better than the patient, so to speak, so that the therapist can give advice and frameworks. So the idea that there is no real grounding for the claim of the therapist and the therapist's advice as better than the patient's own thoughts is disturbing. And then the bureaucrat, I think that MacIntyre thinks this is the type of moral climate in which the managerial bureaucrat thrives, because the bureaucrat, he says, hides behind the fact-value distinction, says, I'm not dealing with values, I'm only dealing with facts. The political process tells me what to do, and then I implement it dispassionately. But MacIntyre says that this is a facade, right? He, in fact, unmasks the bureaucrat and tries to argue that the bureaucrat and the manager, the corporate manager is lumped in with this too, are basically asserting power based on a claim of, quote, effectiveness. But when you really examine what they do, is effectiveness really a part of it? So there, MacIntyre engages in his own unmasking. But is he capable of not being unmasked himself, I guess, is a question to ask. So a little bit more on the corporate and government manager. MacIntyre says, such a person, when you really investigate, that type of person is often not efficient, but often quite the opposite, and that bureaucracy, whether it's corporate or government, as it grows, becomes very bloated and inefficient, and oftentimes, if you examine them, and this is arguable for sure, right? But this is MacIntyre's assertion here. You find that he says that they have no valuable expertise, or that their expertise is actually used in a way that produces poor results. This reminded me of Slavoj Žižek's reference to the salaried bourgeoisie, this group of people that has arisen in society, which is not really the bourgeoisie in the proper sense of owners of anything, but they fill these mid-level managerial positions in corporate and in government sectors, and sort of claim to be using specialized expertise that makes everything more efficient and effective and better. But just like Žižek, MacIntyre doubts that is the case. Effectiveness, he argues, is a masquerade for social control based on nothing except basically a Nietzschean will to power on the part of those in those positions. The corporate and government manager, his authority, according to MacIntyre, is based on a, quote, theater of illusions, similar to the moral neutrality of modern physical science. I think what MacIntyre thinks about hard sciences is that they do tap into physical truths, but that if they proclaim themselves also value neutral, that they then become just as big a problem, if not more so, than the bureaucrat, because they are wielding a great deal of power, and they have a responsibility to think about the human impact of what they do, and hiding behind objectivity they abdicate their responsibility. I think this is kind of implicit in his argument and criticism of both these types, but at least the physical scientists are uncovering physical truths. Here we have Woodrow Wilson. It just so happens that Woodrow Wilson was the one president of the United States who was a person who had education in public administration, so he is a bureaucrat president. MacIntyre goes into explaining how this type of thing emerged. That is how we got our bureaucratic rulers, as he puts them. And again, those are rulers in both the corporate and in the government sector. Well, it at least starts with the birth of social science. He says, but what is it to try to understand human actions in mechanistic terms? Because that's where social science went, in the attempt to become science and fact-based like the hard sciences. Social science tried to understand human action in mechanistic terms. He says, this ideal of mechanical explanation was transferred from physics to the understanding of human behavior by a number of English and French thinkers in the 17th and 18th century. And again, I would say actually, you could definitely look at Thomas Hobbes as, if not the first, then certainly an iconic and fairly early thinker in this regard, who really tried to make even human will and emotion explained by mechanical processes inside the human body. Well, obviously MacIntyre thinks that this ignores that element of the human being that is not material, that has to do with conscience and moral reasoning and character. And of course, he's going to go on to argue for Aristotelian virtue ethics, so character is this unquantifiable and unseen aspect of human beings, which obviously MacIntyre wants to uphold, and which he thinks if you don't uphold it, what you get is this strange attitude towards human beings as parts of a machine that are amenable or is amenable to basically social engineering by expert social scientists. Well, by now we're in chapter 7, by the way, and this is my last slide. I found this quote towards the end of chapter 7 that kind of summarizes up what he thinks was the evolution of this downward spiral towards the technical and mechanistic view of human beings and their management. And it reminded me of Jacques Ellul and the Technological Society, the book Ellul wrote. I have a whole playlist on Ellul if you want to get his perspective on things, but I think that MacIntyre agrees with Ellul that that human beings made a mistake in dealing with human beings as if they could be broken down and understood in a scientific and mechanistic way. So here's the quote. He says, "So we can now see in bare skeletal outline a progress first from the Enlightenment's ideal for a social science to the aspirations of social reformers. Next, from the aspiration of social reformers to the ideals of practice and justification of civil servants and managers. Then, from the practices of management to the theoretical codification of these practices and of the norms governing them by sociologists and organizational theorists. And finally, from the employment of the textbooks written by those theorists in schools of management and business schools to the theoretically informed managerial practice of the contemporary technocratic expert." Well, there's a great deal of critique and hostility here. There's a sense that we've really lost something crucial and important, and I don't think that Alasdair MacIntyre is alone at all. I know he's still alive, but he did a lot of this work in the 20th century, and there were many 20th century thinkers, and I've covered some of them. Ellul is one, Hans Morgenthau is another, who basically began to really worry about our tendency to treat human beings as though they were part of some just social engineering plan, right? Adam Curtis documentaries cover this mentality pretty well, the managerial mentality. And Wendy Brown's book, The Undoing of the Demos, which I did a video on a while back, covers it very recently, this idea that you spread that way of thinking to all the spheres of human life. Is that really a good idea, or does it undo the demos, as she says? And this is a core concern for Aristotle, by the way, is that you have to have the right way of living, the right form of governance, the right attitudes need to be encouraged to have citizens who can be a part of the demos, the people, who can exercise their political power. But as we move towards more and more bureaucratic management, there's less and less space for the political, for citizens to be able to deliberate and make decisions about how they want to live their lives. And I really think this deep concern is what underlies MacIntyre's reasoning here, and he joins in a chorus of thinkers who come at it from different angles and who are continuing to do so. So for that reason alone, studying MacIntyre is a good idea.